So look, it's great. It's great to see you all. We've got a nice intimate gathering, which is, also very good. I've had to say that, in leading up to this topic, it has struck me how unpopular it is. In terms of the sector overall, I think this is perhaps an area of research and practice which is neglected. There is understandably a very strong focus on victims and services for victims. I completely understand that, but I think it is really timely to think about the safety of victims in terms of how we approach perpetrators. What do we do in terms of improving their safety? So it's really wonderful to introduce Andrew Frost today, who's a colleague of mine from Aotearoa, from New Zealand. Andrew was working in Rolleston Men's Prison at the time that I was doing my time in the women's prison. So I had a life sentence there, at the time it was 10 years, and Andrew's had a wee bit longer. I think yours was double life, maybe.
Yeah, I was very bad.
Yeah. So, and he and I, have been sort of colleagues in terms of our social work practice and research over the years. Certainly in my own practice, it involved issues of victimisation, sexual abuse, and indeed sexual perpetration by women. So it's another very neglected aspect of research and sort of practice knowledge. So I'm really looking forward to this presentation with you, Andrew, and I'm not going to take up any more time.
I'd like also to extend my respect to the Turrbal people, the people who've been looking after this land where we're meeting today, and also to Aboriginal and Torres Strait Island people, and more general to the people attending today, also their elders, elders past, elders emerging, and elders present. And I'd also like to, I'm aware that a lot of Aboriginal and Torres Strait Island work in this area is in response to sexual offending. I also want to acknowledge this Wainanga, this place of learning, and the teaching and learning that I've been involved with here and continue to benefit from. And to acknowledge and respect you folks too for your interest in this critical area. What I want to present here is really, there's no kind of firm body of research I'm going to say, here are statistics, that kind of stuff. These are some kind of reflections and musings in some ways, but it reflects a history of working with men and boys since the early 17th century, I think, when I first started teaching. I was a teacher in a secondary school. I liked teaching and I liked the kids, but I didn't particularly like schools very much. One of the practices that we used to have in those days, and I'm sure schools are much better now, they don't do the same thing, but we used to have the naughty kids back behind school, and I started to realise through spending time with these kids, which you inevitably do, that there was quite a lot going on for them that I didn't notice at all in terms of their classroom conduct and my interaction with the classroom, that they had kind of bigger, fuller lives. And I became interested, I think, more interested in the kids than I did in the education in some ways. So I went to work as a residential social worker. I worked in a special school which was ostensibly for educationally disadvantaged boys, so youth really, education. It became apparent to me a lot of those kids were being sexually abused themselves or abused in various kind of ways, and this was something that wasn't really acknowledged. And as somebody once sagely said, you tire of pulling the bodies out of the river and you look upstream, who's pushing them in? And I went to work for the Department of Corrections, which is the period of time that Annabelle was referring to, where I worked in a prison-based sex offender unit for men who were convicted of criminal offences against children persons under the age of 16. It was set up as a therapeutic community, and I understand there are similar kind of arrangements in Australia here too. So it's based on group work. I worked with generally with clinical psychologists in that forum. And so a lot of the things I want to say today are kind of based on my learning from that time. I did my research there, my PhD research, and then following that went on to the University of Canterbury, where some of these ideas were expanded on. I worked with Annabelle. So I've actually been working for CQU since full-time since early June. I've called this talk of monsters and men, and it's about a paradox, I suppose. Sexual abuse, particularly sexual abuse of children, I guess in particular, it's probably the most pernicious and most abhorred kind of human behaviour we can think of, I guess. Maybe because it offends our most cherished values about children, about intimacy, about trust and fellow human faith and so on. And so those men who sexually offend against children in particular, I think, are probably the most marginalised of all human categories, I guess we could say. They're known as predators, pedophile, beasts, and so on. So we kind of vilify these folks because of their vile behaviour, I guess. So this obviously attracts enormous public attention, and there's been a huge commitment into trying to understand what makes these people do it. Mostly men, obviously, why they behave in this way. There's been a lot of research, a lot of kind of academic effort, and in order to try and kind of understand and explain why people would engage in such behaviour. But at the same time, there's a considerable amount of sexual violence that just appears to go undetected. We don't know about it for yonks, maybe never know about it. It goes on, multiple victims, multiple events over many years, but sometimes they come to light. This photo was the front cover of the New York magazine, July 2015. And it depicts 35 of the 46 women who at that time publicly accused Bill Cosby of their rape, some of them relating to up to 45 years previously. So how do we account for such failures of detection? Why didn't we know this was going on? We were so concerned about it. What gets in the way of that? And I suggest part of the reason is we don't want to know. We're reluctant to know about it, which of course leads to those people who are victimised, a lack of faith in their disclosure of their experiencing, because they don't trust a validating social response to their experience. So there is Bill Cosby. In The Guardian on the 18th of November 2014, when all this stuff was coming to light, during the times coming out. This is a Guardian journalist, Lindy West, and I'm just going to quote from what she said. Along with pretty much everyone I know, I grew up watching The Cosby Show with a deep urgency and devotion, as if the show itself kept lights on and my heart pumping. It was one of those pieces of pop culture that dug its roots into your DNA. The Huxtable family became your family. Their house was your safe space. Bill Cosby was your other or only dad. Lisa Bonet was, and still is, your unattainably cool older sister. If I ever found myself on the receiving end of Felicia Richard's disapproving face, I'd probably crumble to the dust and wait for a stiff breeze to rescue me from my shame. This is the world in which Bill Cosby's alleged victims were expected to report their sexual assaults. This is the figure, wholesomeness personified with seemingly limitless funds. They were supposed to challenge in court, saying, America's dad raped me. And this wasn't the first time the accusations had been made. In 2006, 14 women had publicly accused, and 14 accused and 12 went public. They were faced with skepticism, threats, and character attacks. Of course, that's not the only one. He's not the first celebrity to be accused. Many have been accused and subsequently convicted. And that earlier depiction, of course, is a long way from the kind of that recent image of him is a long way from the kind of wobble boards, the glam rock, and the celebrity sainthood that Jimmy Savile attained before his death, and the subsequent Operation Yew Tree in the UK, which was launched after the Jimmy Savile scandal emerged, resulting in several convictions and a number of investigations. And of course, we can't go much further without talking about this man either. This case is probably the apotheosis, isn't it, of hidden in plain view. I mean, this guy is running for president. He's being accused, but somehow he remains above water. As well as this kind of failure in detection, then, how do we explain a failure of prevention? My thesis here is that we don't act at the time of the abuse is happening because we're reluctant to countenance such betrayal, I would suggest, because we have difficulty in hearing these stories, especially about people we know or we think we know. If there are allegations against Uncle X, we tend to say, no, sexual offenders are monsters. You know, they jump out from a bush with a trench coat on and bag of lollies. Uncle X isn't a monster, therefore he's not a sex offender. So we can't countenance, they have great difficulty in countenancing these things. And certainly, in New Zealand we don't have monsters. A lot of sheep, but we don't, surely not in Christchurch, and most assuredly not in the Garden City, Christchurch, Otautahi, where Annabelle and I spent quite a little time. But in fact, here is a man called Dr. Morgan Fei. He's an international, or was an international expert on trauma medicine, pillar of the community, was running for mayor at the time that the allegations were made and the charges were laid. He had an OBE, he was a city councillor, mayoral candidate, and he was charged, convicted in the 1990s. After 34 years of known offending. People knew about this. One of his jobs, and Annabelle was just reminding of this, that Morgan Fei had, one of his tasks was he was does medical examinations for Air New Zealand that the women who came through his medical practice, he got a reputation. He was known as Fingers Fei. That was the epithet that was attached to him, and yet he was going for 34 years. This guy, Brother Bernhard McGraw, when I was a residential social worker, I was telling you about my history before, this guy was revered. Nobody could work with street kids like Brother Bernhard McGraw could. He was brilliant. And in 2013 he was extradited to Australia, where he was sent here, where he carried out more offending. 252 charges between 1977 and 1986, and it was alleged he raped, molested and abused dozens of young boys at church-run institutions. He'd already undergone a prison sentence in New Zealand before he was extradited to Australia. This guy is Graham Capel, leader of a political party in New Zealand called the Christian Heritage Party, and Crown prosecutor who did 6 years in prison for child sexual offences. This man here, young man, dubbed New Zealand's most prolific pedophile. He was a deputy principal of a small community school in New Zealand, cultural performance leader, adult girlfriend, popular teacher, a member of the community. Everybody said he's somebody everybody could go to. Concerns were raised about his behaviour, taking kids home and showering them at home from 1998. These were related to the school's board of trustees. The school failed to act, failed to report on, and so on. So it's another kind of typical story, really. Nobody said anything. People knew, nobody said anything. So these revelations then, they're really shocking. Not just because of the abhorrence that we hold for them, but because we failed to anticipate and detect these things. And so, that's why we have these epithets like beast. And there's kind of, which is an attempt to sort of talk about the abnormality, the monstrousness and the beastly kind of conduct. So what do we do when we kind of deem desires to be pathologically unhealthy or disgusting? We turn those afflicted persons, as we see them, into monstrous outsiders. That's the whole beast and monster thing. And we do this, I think, to distinguish them from ourselves. We can't imagine we're anything like these. These are not proper people. They're very marginalised. They can't be like me. One of the things, in case I don't mention it later, in terms of psychological profile demographics, they're actually more similar, major sexually offender, more similar to the general population than they are to the general criminal population, which is an interesting thing, I think. And so, with this monstrous epithet, then, this epithet of monstrousness and beastliness, I guess we look for tropes to attach them to. And one of the kind of common tropes, I think, is to do with the interesting parallels with Gothic tropes. So Gothic culture is to darkness, madness, disease, superstition, eroticism, obsession, lustfulness, appetite, madness and confusion over what's real and unreal. These are the kind of images that we associate. And indeed, if you look on the internet, you look up sex offender or internet offender, these are the kind of images that come up, interestingly. These hooded kind of figures that are, kind of well associated, aren't they, with those Gothic tropes. And these are pretty common images. The 1980s, 1990s, particularly, there was quite a big thing in the news about the alleged existence of this kind of conspiracy thing about the existence of satanic ritual sexual abuse of children. Maybe some of you remember this kind of period. There's lots of talk about, organised rings of adults who got together and brought children into these sex rings. So there was kind of images on talk in newspapers about naked circles, kids being forced to do all kinds of abhorrent things, eat feces, watch cannibalism. The mind is the limit, really, in terms of what was reported. Children forced to watch unthinkable things. And it was often amongst the claims that the adults were being dressed as witches or monsters or wearing masks. So this thing took on a life of its own for a while. It kind of died out eventually. And in fact, there was no material evidence ever found that these things existed at all. But that's the image, that's the kind of sense that we had that was going on. So certainly, it's in the news, it has been in the news, will be in the news, and it kind of strikes certain cardinal news values, sex, violence, children. These are big cardinal news items, and they're all in the same place. So, we're in danger here of conflating waves of news with waves of crime. They're not necessarily always the same thing. But I think we can't blame the media. It's often a whipping boy, but it makes a place. But what is it appealing to? What are these images actually appealing to? It must be feeding on something. I just want to go back to Christchurch again for a moment and talk about this case. This man here, Peter Ellis, in 1993, was convicted on 16 counts of sexual abuse of children in his care, working in a creche, in a local body creche. He got 10 years imprisonment. So subjecting large numbers of children to what was described in the court as horrific abuse. According to the prosecution, he sexually violated children, defecated and urinated on them, stuck pins into all parts of their body. And these kind of seemingly ludicrous and fantastical kind of notions that were kind of were talked about in court. Subsequently, an author called Lydia Hood wrote a book about the whole thing. And you can see the kind of Gothic representation here, the Gothic writing, and the imagery, to do with witchery and all that kind of stuff. And she whitewashed the whole thing, said this guy should never have been convicted. Because of the kind of things that were admitted in court, she ridiculed the outcome. and so, kind of brought sort of objectivist, rationalist kind of point of view and say, look, these things could not have happened. How did he get convicted? So interestingly, Justice Williamson, the presiding judge, I'll quote from him, "Unlike almost all of those who have publicly feasted off this case, the jury actually saw and heard each of the children. They also heard your own evidence and that of other former Christchurch civic creche workers. The jury disbelieved you. They believed the children. And I agree with that assessment," he said. Both sides of the argument talked about an absence of disclosure, about what was concealed, what was hidden away, what wasn't talked about. So we have to think, maybe Lydia Hood's got a point here. Well, how come this happened? One way of thinking about this, maybe, one way of thinking, we don't know everything that might be caught because of the rules around courts and that sort of thing. But I'm going to suggest to you that one way you can make sense of this is maybe these kids had no other way of talking about what happened to them. They had no other language, they had no other discourse, they had no other metaphors to use than to talk about these kind of cages and things that happened to them. It's a possibility. Certainly he was convicted, so the jury and the judge were convinced. So what are the alternative discourses then? What other discourses can we rely on? What other kind of metaphors can we use in order to describe the behaviour of people who sexually abuse, and particularly sexually abused children? And one of the kind of ways we do this is have a look at the kind of discourse of masculinity, and particularly the hydraulics metaphor that tends to be used in relation to these folks. Psychological formulations of sexual aggression actually kind of seem to rely on a lot of these metaphors themselves. So you talk about etiological, personological factors, biological influences, family dynamics that are considered in relation to what caused men to behave in this way, what caused them to engage in these particular kind of practices and habits. So they might conclude that they were fixated at a particular age in their life, or they refer particularly to certain mechanisms that resulted in their sexually abusive conduct. They use metaphors particularly of drives and blocks and triggers, the activation of certain urges and impulses. So it's like 19th century hydraulics, the kind of language that's used in these explanations. And they talk about fusion of sexual drives. So severe personal distress, for instance, can act as a trigger for thoughts and behaviours, discrete thoughts and behaviours, that are situational triggers to overcome disinhibitory safety mechanisms, that people, the incest taboo and that kind of stuff that we have. These are seen as kind of barriers that are overcome by particular kind of forces or mechanisms. And so, if we think of things like psychodynamics, we think of these kind of early experiences that stay within us and then they manifest themselves somehow as behaviour if they're not kind of dealt with, they're not addressed in later life. So abusers then are seen as kind of like conduits for flows of energy, and this flow of energy will come out. And we've seen this a lot in terms of psychological treatment of sexual offenders, particularly early days. There's lots of emphasis on anger management, as though this was a kind of energy force inside people that would explode out. If men didn't get their needs met, it would kind of explode out horribly somehow. I'm not sure how useful those kind of mechanisms are, especially if we're trying to work with men to achieve kind of self-determination and manage these kind of things, if they see themselves as kind of mechanisms and conduits of energies. So I have this kind of cause and effect dynamics, and it's these things are we can talk about as structuralism and behaviorism and functionalism, but they tend to have these things in common, I think. So there's that one kind of discourse. There's also the medical discourse, the kind of the sickness metaphor. These people have got a sickness. They have pedophilia, or they have hypersexuality, that kind of stuff. These as syndromes, these things are very, very hard to pin down. To qualify for pedophilia, I'm not even sure it's in the latest Diagnostic and Statistical Manual of the there's any psychologists they might know. Is pedophilia still in the diagnostic and statistical mean? Anyway, it was for a long time, but it's virtually meaningless because, you know, in order to qualify for it, you had to have 3 sexual fantasies about children 5 times a day for 15 minutes or something like that. You can't, that's probably a little bit facile, but operationally, they're kind of meaningless. So the sickness thing doesn't really do it. So here's an alternative kind of a competing hypothesis, if you like, another way of looking at things, that abusers choose to impose their will on others in a disempowering context. The context is disempowering in that it provides little hope for the victimized person that their attempt to seek help will be met with a helpful response, with a validating social response. So we can ask, rather than what caused this offending, in what context does the person choose to enact violence? And of course, with that kind of thinking, if we can think about violence much more broadly too, and this is the kind of discourse that's quite useful in the domestic family violence as well. So, my thinking around this really is working with sex offenders for a long time and being a social worker, having a social work background as opposed to a psychologist background. The psychologists were a lot of the time interested in the intrapsychic things, what happened within people. My interest was kind of what happened between people, how can we understand interaction aspects and the circumstances in which people offend. And one of the things that's become quite clear, I think, is that there are certain circumstances, certainly in which child sexual abuse tends to happen. It tends to involve these things, I think. Exploitation is one thing. So that's taking advantage, using some power differential, a power privilege, in order to take advantage and sexually exploit someone else and impose them to subjugation and control. This term grooming, I like this term less and less, I think, the notion of grooming. I prefer to think of it as kind of coercive entrapment, really, over time. Grooming is that thing that monkeys do with each other. I don't think it really stands up, but that's true of all the language around us. But I think it is a useful concept. And I use the term because it's still used a lot. But this notion of creating a kind of a bridge between a pre-abusive behaviour and an abusive. So inveigling somebody into an abusive context by using bridges, using affection, using what that lesser, using the power differential to take advantage of certain needs that young person, that child might have, such as a need for affection. And I'm sure you can guess at all the other kind of inducements. So they might take advantage of family and kinship networks in order to do that. And it's a process of entrapment, predatory entrapment. Secrecy and concealment. These things, secrecy and concealment, child sexual abuse particularly, two things are like that. They're inextricably intertwined. And so a perpetrator will typically recruit the victim into helping to maintain the secrecy and concealment by saying things like, if you tell, this dreadful thing will happen, or nobody will ever believe you. And they're probably right. And maybe they don't even have to say anything because of the context. So it might entirely be tacit. Collusion is this notion of a complicity of the context, really, is the attachment to or tolerance of conduct, attitudes, beliefs that actually support the abuse, which contributes to the acceptability of abuse in a broader sense. If we're kind of broadening this kind of notion of what the collusive or the kind of semi-tolerance of sexual idealization of children, so we can look at child beauty pageants. We can go broader than that, and the Olympics are on recently. And if you watch beach volleyball, you'll notice the difference between men's outfits and women's outfits. What's women's contribution to volleyball? Well, it's a piece of fabric about 5 centimeters wide, and that's actually Olympic rule. At some point, the bottom garment for a woman playing beach volleyball has to be no more than 5 centimeters wide. So it's that kind of environment. And finally, blame shifting is another common ingredient in all sexual abuse. It's attempts to evade responsibility. Say, well, I was drunk at the time, I didn't know what I was doing. She was only 4 years old, but you should have seen the way she flicked her eyelashes at me. It was definitely she wanted that. So, I know it seems ludicrous, but that's the kind of way that we see people try to absolve themselves from responsibility. This in the news just recently was pointed out to me by a colleague, a recent thing, Michael Quinn, this guy who went off to Los Angeles, ostensibly to play rugby with his Melbourne rugby team, and tried to attend what was referred to as a party there. He blamed meth addiction. But you can see a kind of like a sympathetic depiction of himself on Facebook and that kind of stuff, which kind of belies that monstrousness underneath. It doesn't look like a monster. Unfortunately, he wasn't wearing a hood. So I want to move this along a bit now to talk about contexts, the circumstances in which sexual abuse is allowed to happen, or the sort of context that is conducive to sexual abuse. I'm kind of wanting to relate to circumstances rather than individual properties, if you like. And in doing this, this is not against Catholic religion. This is about institution, the Catholic Church institution, and aspects of it. Just as a kind of segue to that. So interestingly, the church carries more Gothic tropes with it. As a church, corrupt churchmen and atheism. These are aspects of the Gothic kind of tropes as well. Exploitation, we can see, and you'll be aware, there's internationally, across decades, since at least the mid-20th century, there have been child sexual abuse scandals in the Catholic Church. So if we look at these ingredients again and think about exploitation, well, there's a strong patriarchal power structure within the Catholic Church. They've been resistant to access by women to positions of authority forever. There's an idealization of the office of priest and of the notion of mandatory celibacy, which kind of, this exaltation supports this hierarchy, I would suggest. So the office of priest also affords a protection through the symbolism of the clothing and the trappings associated in the minds of parishioners with moral perfection. Can't do anything wrong. He's a conduit to God, a kind of link to God. Potential for grooming. The priest occupies a special position between the believer on the one hand and God on the other. It's a very hallowed resource. That's a very powerful resource that person has. Would they choose to take advantage of it? And clearly, not many do, but the ones do create a lot of harm. So the priest in this position occupies this special position and has access to spiritual reward, ultimate salvation, well-being, and so on. They also have the power to appoint and assume authority over others, appoint positions to members of the choir, altar boy status, and so on. But secrecy is another aspect that is at work here, I think. Recent history associated with the attempts of the Catholic hierarchy. I'm talking about the previous Pope, rather than the current administration here, actually. But to deal with revelations of in-house sexual abuse, appealing to victims not to reveal it, paying victims not to talk about it, shifting priests from parish to parish in order to try and kind of neutralise the effect, but of course they tend to go on and use others. So, and secrecy is often associated with this other factor of collusion. Frawley O'Day, a writer, 2004, she said, if it takes a community to raise a child, it also takes a community to abuse one. Whenever a minor is sexually violated, somebody's eyes are closed. So this strategies and the collusive strategies of treating, retiring, or even reassigning offenders within the church, and it's kind of covered by the sacrosanct nature of confession, the secrecy of confession, the sacrament of confession. In terms of blame shifting, the response of church authorities to the revelations of sexual abuse have been generally to externalise blame, saying society as evil itself, and that society, if you like, holds this kind of meta-culpability for being kind of for sexualising priests and so on. This was actually reported in this case here. Again, this is the previous Pope. Vatican radio broadcast said that, talking about the attacks on the church by the media, talked about their motive, the motive for attacks. And they said the Pope defends life and the family based on marriage between a man and a woman in a world which powerful lobbies would like to impose a completely different agenda, the head of the disciplinary commission of the Holy See officials said on the radio. And so you get people like Monsignor William Lynn, the first American official convicted of sex cover-ups. The judge in this case said he enabled monsters in clerical garb to destroy the souls of children. So part of a kind of, this man wasn't necessarily involved in direct sexual abuse himself, but he was aware of it and allowed it to happen. And I'm sure you folks will be aware of Australian scandals in the church as well. What happened in the Ballarat diocese over a number of years, particularly in the 70s and 80s. The Australian newspaper is currently running quite a story on this. So there was a police officer involved and tried to investigate it, found himself held up all the way around by police and clergy. He's only just received an apology now, decades after his career kind of fell flat. And Cardinal Pell, in talking to the Royal Commission, has said in February, and talking about Monsignor Day here, who had another criminal priest, another abusive priest, Gerald Ridsdale, who was also working in the same diocese. At the time, Cardinal Pell was an associate bishop, some office like that, I can't remember the exact term, who claimed he really didn't have much idea. He said, it's a sad story and it wasn't of much interest to me. So the idea of a story then, is there a sexual violence narrative? I'm going to suggest if there is, it looks like this. It involves one person, this is the bare bones, it involves one person choosing to violate the dignity of another person. That's any kind of violence, I suppose, in some ways, any kind of violence that's carried out in an intimate scenario. It involves a process of entrapment in a disempowering context. The victim considers strategies of resistance and might act on those strategies of resistance. We don't hear much about those, by the way. And that person assesses the chances of seeking help successfully and concludes that they're probably poor. So based on the expectations of if they did disclose, well, I guess a key question is, if I told, or we say people have disclosed, we said to them, as a result of your disclosure, did your life get better? I wonder how many would actually say yes to that. I suspect they wouldn't. So rather than asking what caused the abuse then, I think a more relevant question is what context does the abuser choose to enact sexual violence? This guy, Ken Plummer, talked about, interviewed a number of men who had sexually offended against children, and tried to talk to men who had interest in sexual offending against children but never acted upon it. It's an interesting kind of potential population we don't know anything about. There might be men who have a sexual interest in children but never act on it. But they can't tell their story because nobody wants to hear it. And even those we do know about and are undergoing sex offender programs are allowed to tell their story, but they have to do it in a particular way. There's a kind of very restricted and narrow and rigid way of telling that story. So we don't kind of find out much about them, about their lives and so on. And I think that is unfortunate. In an attempt to conclude then, I'm going to suggest, there are certain restraints on the possibilities for socially constructing abusers. Well, I think this might be the key to understanding the paradox. We hark back to the metaphor of the monster because contemporary stories of sex offenders cannot be publicly told. The real stories can be told, the detailed stories. Monsterification, I'm going to suggest to you, has two key problems with it. One is that I think that we're less likely to recognise the abuse, as I was talking about Uncle X before. We're less likely to see the abuse happening, to detect it, to see it. And also, I suggest that it contributes to an increased likelihood of reoffending because the men that I worked with, when they went back out in the community, often were up against very, very strict rules, which is kind of demanded by the electorate, and little room to move, often monitored and surveilled in an intrusive and aggressive way. And I think under these circumstances, they're more likely to go underground. And once they go underground, they're more likely to experience the kind of circumstances and they're more likely to abuse. And the only thing more dangerous than a sex offender we know about is a sex offender we don't know about. It's very problematic, I think. So, yeah, I guess my suggestion here maybe is the key is to look at the context rather than causation and metaphors and imagery. Because a witch hunt requires a witch. And that's all I have prepared to say today.